Hi, everyone. My name is Beth Sheffield, Adult Programming Coordinator at the Greensboro Public Library. Welcome to Soul Food Looks Back, a conversation with Carla Hall and Jessica B. Harris. This is part of our citywide celebration for Juneteenth, and we're so honored to have you ladies here today. I want to say on behalf of the Greensboro Public Library and the Greensboro Public Library Foundation, to all those in our audience, welcome to the program. Thank you, those of you that support our Library Foundation. It's because of you that we have great programming like this. If you'd like to learn more about the YouTube channel or the cookbooks or Greensboro Learning Circles, check out our website at www.greensborolibrary.org. Now it's my pleasure to turn over the conversation to Ms. Carla Hall and Ms. Jessica B. Harris. Ladies, let's talk a little bit about your beginnings and the connection of food and culture.
I think my earliest memories about my food was at my grandmother's house. I think that's probably similar to a lot of people. Sunday suppers, after church, going to her house in Lebanon, Tennessee. I did not think that I was going to be in food. I thought that I was going to be an actor. Before that, I thought I was going to be a cartoonist. And then I thought I was going to be a race car driver. The race car driving was just sort of, that would be fun. Definitely something creative, but I ended up being an accountant. And it wasn't until I left accounting and decided that I really had to find a passion, and I didn't know what that was. And food sort of came about through friendships and socialization when I was in Paris. With one of Jessica's friends, we found out.
Indeed, indeed.
Yeah, who was that?
Elaine.
Oh gosh, it was a dear friend of mine named, at that point in time, she was Elaine Evans. She is now Khadija Evans. And so we connected on food through Elaine, me at one end of the chain, Carla at another.
Exactly. Oh my gosh. You know what I'm realizing, Jessica, talking about that chain though, you were at the beginning of the chain. In terms of the three of us, and then you tagged Elaine. And then Elaine tagged me with the interest. It's crazy because that really was the turning point that started my interest in cooking.
So it was really kind of wild to discover that very inadvertently, I had a hand in starting Carla being interested in food. So
yes.
But yeah, it's wacko. And my beginnings are a little like Carla's. I started out with the food at my grandmother's house, but I am not a Southerner. Although my father was originally from Tennessee, from Centerville, Tennessee. I grew up as a Northerner. I grew up in New York City, in Queens. But my paternal grandmother was actually seriously rooted in the South. And so I grew up eating and being very Southern. My first times back in the South, I was a full-grown adult, but everybody kept saying, boy, you do Southern really well, because I can ma'am with the best of them. You know, we've had great fun. I didn't know that I was going to end up in food either. Like Carla, I wanted to be an actress. I, at that point, even went to the High School of Performing Arts in New York, sort of fame, I'm going to live forever. But I went through, I worked at Essence as a journalist. I started writing about food through travel because I've always traveled. My college major was French, so I speak fluent French, and I'd always traveled. And so the idea of travel and food and culture was something that kind of came together with me. I do have to say though, Carla, never wanted to be a race car driver. In fact, even though I have a valid New York City driver's license, which I renew with religious fervor, I am a native New York City child and basically a non-driver.
What were some of the aha moments that you had along your travel?
My ancestors are from the Yoruba people from Nigeria, and the Bubi people from Bioko Island. And those were two different tests. Like on my mom's side was Nigerian, and then on my dad's side, the Bubi people of Bioko Island. And so when I was at the embassy of Nigeria, and it was revealed to me about there were only 3 ships that came from Bioko Island to Virginia. And so when you go to the Museum of African American History and Culture, they list the numbers of the slave ships. And so when you think of one of 3 my ancestors were on, it was pretty incredible. You know, so that just got me to thinking more deeply about my food.
Well, again, Carla, we are at sort of, for years, I have said, I really don't want to know. I have, in fact, spent a fair amount of time on the African continent, and I know that I have affinities. I've seen people who look like my father in Senegal. You know, I've seen folks who look like my relatives in a variety of places. And I have certainly made friends who have become family in Senegal, in Benin, and in other parts of the continent. By religious affiliations, I connect with the Yoruba people of Western Africa through Brazil, but I never wanted to check, because it would be in some ways definitive and therefore limiting, and I wanted to be, you know, be able to be Kirkum Africa and to be able to be everyman in that sense. I have undertaken a project which means writing about my family and writing about 5 generations of my family and their relationships to food. And I probably do now need to know where we are from to connect it back, because I can connect back through and to and a little beyond my great-grandfather who was enslaved in Virginia. I also know about my paternal great-grandmother, but beyond that, you know, the first census after the Civil War, in which Black people were listed, you know, as individuals as opposed to as goods, I can find my relatives on that. But to go beyond that is going to be the interesting jump. And I would say to you, I would want to see the manifests for those ships and those 3 ships that came. I'd like to know where the people were, and those manifests are around and available. So you got research to do, girl.
What is kind of the, you know, some of those myths around food?
I think that we have an awful lot of myths. Certainly in the postbellum South, the traditional African-American diet has become meat heavy. But it's meat heavy as a result of a traditional diet that was almost vegetarian, that in which meat was pretty much used as a seasoning thing and not necessarily as an ingredient, an end to itself. So that's a bit of a myth as well. But along with that, I mean, we think of the African-American soul food diet is unhealthy. It's not. It's perfectly fine if you are getting up in the morning, going out, having that heavy breakfast, and then going out and plowing the back 40. It's not healthy if you're getting up after a decent night's sleep, sliding your ever widening behind into a, you know, the vehicle of your choice to drive to work, to sit at a desk. It's about what these diets supported. Let's think about how long those voyages took, and they took certainly weeks and on occasion months. And the situations were, you know, we don't want to talk about them because they're just horrific. I mean, you're chained to somebody, you're in somebody else's, depending on the way the ship was packed, already there is horrific. You could be in somebody's poop. You don't know what was going on. You don't know what happened. And so to begin to think about, hairstyles and controls that may or may not have existed. But it's a little hard to say this is because of that. I think that there are all sorts of myths that have accreted around the food of African Americans, and in many ways because a lot of what was written by third party observers. It wasn't written by the people themselves. It was written by somebody talking about the people, talking about the individuals. The things that the people said were oral history, and oral history can be very specific and very much a part of things. I think oral history is as accurate as history, because remember, history is always from somebody's point of view. We forget that too.
Yeah. It's interesting as you talk about that, and you talk about oral history. So when I was doing my travels, I mean, even the travels that I did for Carla Hall Soul Food, and I had no preconceived notions about what I was going to find, what recipes. I really wanted the information to drive whatever I did. And I was in South Carolina with BJ Dennis, and I went to BJ's house on a Sunday, and his mom was there, and we were just talking about her childhood, and I was trying to get a sense of what she was eating as a child. And she talked about shrimp that they would go and catch, and how sweet it was and delicious, and how it would be so simple. And then we started talking about shrimp and grits, and she was like, first of all, we didn't have a bunch of stuff on our shrimp. You know, when you have shrimp and grits now, it's all in gravy, and the grits sometimes have cheese, and it's really heavy. She's like, first of all, when you think about it, we were lactose intolerant. So we didn't have a lot of milk and everything. Plus milk was expensive. So we had stone ground grits that we may have thrown a bay leaf in, or salt and pepper. It was very simple. We made it with water. And then we had the shrimp that maybe had some peppers and onions, you know, maybe if you wanted to, some fresh tomatoes, but it was a really simple dish. But the sweetness of the shrimp, you didn't want to cover up, because that was the star, right? And even when you think about how those dishes came about and how they changed as they went into restaurants, and there was and people were more affluent and they had more resources. But when you strip back all of the things that we have put on our food, that was a huge aha for me. And so when I went from that, I'm like, okay, what else? What else have we changed? And how can I go back with my food to these dishes, strip back all of the stuff that we put onto it to get back to a healthier version that really is more sustainable for our bodies today?
Absolutely, absolutely. But you also bring up something again with the whole idea of we are all lactose intolerant. Some of us are not.
Right.
Because I mean, if you think about the people who were herders, who lived on cattle and from cattle, you didn't kill the cattle, so drank the milk, and you made some form of fermented beverage or cheese or whatever.
Let's talk a little bit about this, a cultural appropriation versus sort of cultural honoring. You know, what is soul food? You know, it's you know, you see that term. But let's just go there. What is soul food to both of you? What do you think about that?
Pretty much every cuisine has, you know, food for the soul of one sort or another. I think that the terminology comes out of a time that I certainly remember when everything was soul. You had a, you know, soul brother and soul sister, and there was a beauty salon where Elaine worked that we referred to earlier called Soul Scissors. You know, there was soul everything. And I think soul food is a part of that. Now, somebody like Adrian Miller, who's actually written a book on the history of soul food, would be able to give you the exact etymology and when the term first appeared. And I unfortunately have, if I knew it, it's gone. And I suspect I didn't know it in any case. But this term has now been equated with the food of African Americans. Africa is not a country, it's a continent. African American food is not monolithic. There are regionalisms, there are localisms even. If you get down to it, people who cook gumbo in X part of New Orleans aren't like people who cook gumbo in Y part of New Orleans. And some folks eat potato salad in their gumbo. Some folks eat rice in their gumbo. Some folks may eat both in their gumbo. So you've got all of these different things that are somehow or other subsumed under that's soul food. And it becomes at the same time honoring, because you are talking about your soul, you are talking about it is food that feeds you, but limiting because people have preconceived notions of what it is.
Mm-hmm. I want to say, and as Jessica's talking about this, Jessica's very instrumental in designing the idea of the cafe at the National Museum of History and Africa, and the National Museum of, oh my God,
African American
History and Culture. NAACP. You know, I mean, because they don't want to say African American Museum. So, I mean, and those 4 regions, which are so important, Jessica, and it blew my mind away. And going there, when the museum had reached out to me to be an ambassador, it really was your work that also added to getting my DNA done. And like, oh my gosh, because I am from the South. And I think people take that region, and I'm from the Southeast, and I will be the first to say it's very different being in Tennessee, the food from North Carolina, South Carolina, you know, that it is in Georgia. And, you know, and so when Jessica came in and says, okay, there is the Creole South, you have the North, you have the West, and then you have the agricultural South,
the agricultural.
Maybe the agricultural South. So you have at least 4 regions. And in those regions, as you talked about, Jessica, are influenced by whatever immigrants came to those regions. And so it broadens what we should be proud about in terms of our contributions. But also, I think one of the things that really excited me years later, as I'm looking at our food and I'm learning more about my history, which is what NAACP did, the museum, was it broadened why I should be proud. So when I see soul food written, I feel that the term soul food as it relates to African Americans or Black people should be capitalized, because it is our American food. And so we don't have a country to relate to. It's not like, you know, Indian food or Italian food or, you know, even African food. So it becomes our country, our connection to this food. And I think as an appreciation of it, it should be capitalized.
Okay, I can definitely go for that as an acknowledgement of the fact that it is a proper noun, said the English teacher.
Correct.
So you, not a common noun, you want to capitalize it. Okay,
yes.
I can absolutely agree with that. And I mean, and I think the whole thing is, it's one of those things that we debate and it can be divisive. You know, people are divided about whether you agree or whether you disagree. The bottom line is, let's, you know, bury that hatchet maybe in, you know, opening some good barbecue somewhere. But we really need to start to think about the idea of extending that definition, of looking at it. I mean, I am in my food scholarship, if such a thing exists, fascinated by the connectors, how these foods connect us to the African diaspora, how these foods connect us to the world that was created by those god-awful slave ships. And that world that was created by those ships is a world certainly on this side of the Atlantic that extends from north, and, you know, all of that scattering of people who fought for the British crown and then ended up in Nova Scotia called Blue Noses, all the way down to Bolivia, where there are Afro-Bolivians and people don't ever talk about them. But if you look at the whole scope of that, then you can see that there's an awful lot culinarily, not even to talk about historically, that connects us. And that's amazing. And so for people who limit this and go, oh, that's just soul food. It's like, yeah, but do you understand what that means? Do you understand what that really means? The thing, though, is that Juneteenth in my youth was a Texas holiday. I didn't grow up with Juneteenth. So Juneteenth is a holiday that's growing in importance. Juneteenth is a holiday that is growing in any number of things. Miss Opal is in her 90s. She is a native Texan, and I think a multi-generational Texan. And I remember asking her, one of the things that we connect with Juneteenth is red drink, some form of red drink. And I asked her, did it exist when she was a child? And she said, I don't remember red drink. So a lot of things are traditions that we are building, traditions that we are making, traditions that we are perhaps reconnecting to. But at its inception, first of all, if we think about the basis of Juneteenth, that whole idea of someone coming into Galveston, where slavery was still in effect, even though it had been, no longer the law of the then reunited land, and puts up something that says, folks are now free. People didn't say, let's go out and have barbecue.
Right.
That was not how it started.
Right. They weren't thinking about, what I'm going to eat. They were probably thinking about, let me find the rest of my family.
Thank you. Yeah, it's like, well, if they were thinking anything, they were probably thinking he lying.
Right.
Thinking, I don't know what that's about. They probably, that was momentous, important, and extraordinary news. It had to take a while to sink in. Now, certainly a year later, the celebrations begin. And they were about feasting in some ways. But that big barbecue, that thing that we now know, comes later. That comes later. It has to. But when it comes with a vengeance, because it's about barbecue, and it's about red drink, and it's about, in some cases, it's even about rodeos and definitely picnics and families and parades and all kinds of stuff.
Yes, I mean, apparently, on June 19th, we would have been, quote unquote, physically free. But how long did it take to become mentally free? Is that still happening? So that's why I feel the celebration. That's why I feel the celebration and having that corridor would be momentous, as Miss Opal says, because it's going into Independence Day. I think that, that when I grew up, I didn't know about Juneteenth either, because I was in Tennessee. And, you hear about these holidays later in life, and something that happened in one part of the country, reverberates all over the country as we have gotten further and further away from it and seeing the significance of it. But when you think about it, even though that was one city, it was really the first Black Lives Matter. I mean, it wasn't just them, because unless everybody is free, we weren't all free. And for everybody to celebrate that, when you think about it, has a connection to Black Lives Matter.
Oh, absolutely.
When you're asked to judge, even if you've got other commitments, you try and do that, because there might be an up and coming chef of color, and you might be the only one on the panel of color to give that person acknowledgement.
Right, or even to share their perspective, because I have been on a panel of judges that were all Italian, of Italian descent. And so, not saying that all Italians are alike, but all Italians from New York. I'm just saying. So, and for me to be there as a Black woman from the South, I have a completely different perspective. And so this one particular time that Beth is mentioning, it was on a show. The two finalists were African American. They were doing a meal, and somebody, you know, in constructively criticizing the meal or judging the meal, they said, "I don't recall this being part of this celebration." And I said, "Well, when was the last time you were at this kind of a celebration?" Because it absolutely, from my perspective as a Black woman who shares a similar background with these two people, it was a part of our celebration. And so it's that. So that little thing to change people's perspective in that moment, to let people know that, oh, there is somebody who is doing something outside of what I'm doing. Because you can never honestly, truly have that experience because you haven't lived it. You can only share it with somebody, right? And so it was in that moment that I realized how important it is for me to say yes to being a voice at that table.
Let's talk a little bit about both the kind of the lack of representation and opportunity for women, and also, I guess, women of color as well.
2 years ago, in 2019, my cookbooks were inducted into the James Beard Cookbook Hall of Fame. And I remember getting up and saying something to the effect of, I am, you know, honored, as I certainly am, by having the books inducted. But the interesting thing for me was not one of them had been nominated for a James Beard Award, which is pretty telling in terms of what happened. But I realized that, and then in 2020, well, I guess it was also in 2019 because it's something that I said in front of an audience, and I didn't speak in front of an audience in 2020. But in 2019, I also said, you know, I was in food before food was cool. We are all speaking to a certain kind of moment in time as though it has been forever thus. It has not. This is something that has existed in the past, maybe 30 years, arguably 40 years, and not much beyond that. Food and African Americans in food were in very different places. And we don't necessarily think back at that because we don't have that, you know, breadth of time and space that I do, thanks to, you know, gray hair and stuff. But I think that that's something that we need to be mindful of. African Americans in food, African American chefs have been around for forever, pretty much since there was food. One of the things that I tell people or harangue people about when I lecture is, you know, when we got here, 1619 and before 1619, because 1619 is just about arrival into the British colonies. There were other dates and they go back. But when we got here, what did we do? We grew the food. We harvested it. We prepared it. We did all of those things. We served it. We cooked it, you know, and, you know, we did beyond that. We have always been involved in this. And yet at the point in time when food becomes lucrative, if you will, when cooking goes from being domestic work to being professional work, we are left out. We are no longer making that jump. And the fact of no longer making that jump has meant that we are not acknowledged for all of the work that we have done in the food system. So that as we flash forward to now all of these culinary competitions, and all of these varying judges of varying backgrounds, many of them not African American, most of them not even people of color, but certainly not African American.
And very few women.
And very few women on top of that. We've got a whole nother set of inequities that are being set up, that are being in their own ways established. You know, I did X in this, I won Y in that, I am this, that, and the other. But who does the laying on of hands? who does that, putting you on that pedestal or wherever it is you are? Who is that? And does that person understand you, your food, your background, your culinary traditions, any of that? Where are you from? And Carla's nodding her head like she in church.
I am nodding my head like I'm in church, because I also think about how when you ask, I don't care who it is, a man or a woman, who was their influence in the kitchen, and many times they will go back to a woman. And so, and many times I've seen people go back to somebody who was a caretaker in their home. I mean, like a domestic.
Look at traditional gendered food roles. It was always mistress of the stew pot, that long, low, and slow cooking, master of the flame. I mean, men tend to, and these are all gross generalities, tend to cook over live fire. Women tend to cook on hearths in some other kind of way, even if it is fire in, on a potager, a stew hole stove, a large, hearth cooking. But it's a different kind of mastery that is, up until very recently, was always very gendered. When we look at professional kitchen, we go to France and we look at Escoffier and folks like that there who codified it, and who codified it like an army, which is why it's called a kitchen brigade, brigade de cuisine. But when you look at that, then one of the things that I always contend when I lecture is, and when Escoffier got home, he expected his wife to have a meal on the table. So that we've got this divergence between the professional kitchen, the brigade, and that home cooking, which the French sometimes call la cuisine bourgeoise. It's all of those wonderful mama cooks in Lyon. And I've forgotten what, but they are those women who are the nurturers and who are the culture bearers. Women are the culture bearers. So it becomes that whole culture bearing, nurturing aspect of food that takes place on the, what used to be called, probably not complimentarily, but the distaff side. That whole idea of women being the nurturers, women being the caretakers, the caregivers, and so on and so forth.
I wanted to talk a little bit about a couple of projects that you both have in progress right now. Carla, you want to talk a little bit about eatokra.com?
Yes. So a couple named Anthony and Janique Edwards started eatokra.com, and it is a list of Black restaurants around the nation. And I think they have about 1,500 businesses that have signed up. And it's a great way to go on the app. And they're a tech company, basically. They're a tech company, but it's a great way to go on the app. And when you're traveling, to find, if you want to support a Black business, to actually support a Black business. And this is not all of the Black restaurants and business eateries in the nation, but it is a sampling of them. And I love what they're doing. So, and I definitely use the app.
Okay, so it's sort of like an online 21st century green book.
Yes. Oh my gosh. Yes, Jessica.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Indeed. Lovely to know about that. Okay, so my most recent project is that my book, High on the Hog, is a 4-part Netflix docuseries. And it has dropped. It is out there. Please watch it. The host, Steven Satterfield, will take you on a journey into the food of African Americans that I hope you will enjoy.
So what was this experience like? I mean, what was it like going from the book to like a series?
I had very little to do with it. The book was optioned by two wonderful women, Fabienne Toback and Karis Jagger, and they fought like mama lionesses for the book and fought and got Roger Ross Williams, who is an Academy Award winning documentarian, on board, got Stephen Satterfield to be the host, and have, you know, adopted my baby and brought my baby to life. So it is quite an experience.
That's fantastic. And Carla has a book coming out in the fall. So Carla and the Christmas Cornbread will be out this fall.
Indeed. I am so excited. I've wanted to do a children's book for a long time. And, you know, out of all the things that I said I wanted to do when I was a kid, and I said I loved art, I thought I wanted to be a cartoonist. I never went down that path. So I've always been fascinated with cartoons and children's books. I mean, I still buy children's books for myself. But I finally did one. The artist is Cherise Harris. She lives in Barbados, and she's an amazing artist. And she really understood the characters. The book takes place when I was 7 years old, so in the 70s. So in terms of coming up with patterns of the clothes and my grandparents and my mom, and just honestly, this was something else, you know, that wasn't in the story. And that is when she called me and she was doing the art, and she said, Carla, you know, for Christmas, you know, did you have a roller in your hair for special occasions? Did you curl your bangs? I'm like, oh my gosh, yes, but it wasn't written in the story. And that is the importance of like cultural connections, something that is not written in the words, but you have to see visually. And so she has these pictures of my sister and I have a roller in my hair and like our ponytails or pigtails being rolled because we always dressed up for Christmas morning. And that was just amazing. Yeah.
I can't wait to see it. And that whole idea of a roller in the hair.
Do you have some suggestions or some tips for people who want to maybe record their family recipes at this time of year?
I'm gonna take age precedence with you, Carla, because I want you to have the last word on this. But I want to say I really think that one of the things would be to look at everybody's got a video camera. We all have phones. Our phones take videos. We know that. Video it, because writing it down is going to capture only a part of it.
Great advice.
Thing that nobody tells you about, that little turning it this way to turn it that way, that little finishing it off, the way the knife is used, the way the spoon is held, the way the thing goes in the oven if it's an oven thing. All of that'll be there on a video. You can write down the 2 cups of this and the 1 cup of that, and that'll be fine. But make sure it's on a video, because we have become people of the video as much or more than we are people of the written word. One of the difficulties for me with writing recipe is limited in what it can tell you to do, unless it becomes this massive tome. And who wants to read a 4-page recipe?
I agree with you, Jessica. And it's interesting because back in the day, in the 30s, you pick up a cookbook and there were 5 recipes on a page because people cooked. So they just had like a little jotted notes and some ingredients, and then that was it. But I am going to agree with you in terms of videotaping, because what I was going to say, the reason that people have so much difficulty in recreating family recipes is because they're only focused on the words. And there is not the feeling. If you try to capture the person's feeling and why they are making this dish and all of the heart that goes into it, you would have a much better end product, you know, or dish than you would if you're just intellectually trying to get this dish. When you can see the person, and Jessica, I think that's such a great idea. When you can see them cooking, you are almost reliving that moment of seeing them. And then the written.
who are some chefs you're excited about? Who are some new, up and coming chefs?
There are people that I know and that I trust and go to, but generally speaking, I am not necessarily a follower of new chefs. I mean, there's J.J. Johnson in New York, there's Omar Tate in Philly. There are a lot of people who are private chefs.
There's so many Black chefs you don't see, you don't know, because you're expecting to find them in restaurants when they are in hotels and they're doing private chefing. And in anticipation of you asking that, Beth, I was just snooping around online, and that's honestly how I find people. That's how I find restaurants, because I'm always traveling, and I will go online like, where's the best restaurant and blah blah blah, where are the Black chefs and blah 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 blah. And I found this article of private chefs in Charlotte.
Okay.
And they listed like several Black private chefs, and their businesses have exploded during the pandemic because people weren't going out and they still wanted to celebrate at home. And I jotted down a couple of names because I was like, wow, this is really great. Because I've been traveling around, it's easy to go into a town, you're planning a dinner, you're like, you know what, I think I'll hire one of these people to come into the house and just so I can have a dinner with some friends. But it was Taylor Worsley, Lisa Brooks of Heart and Soul, Keisha LaShawn Corbett, Joya Courtney, Chef Tracy Mitchell, Anthony Smith, Chianti Peak, Kevin Winston. And this was an article written by Charlotte 5. And I thought it was really impressive, especially because one of the projects that I'm working on is with a play, and it talks about food and song and music and everything. It's called Grace, and it talks about the 5 Philadelphia catering companies, and that's where you find a lot of Black chefs. And another reason that I brought it up is because I remember a guy coming up to me years ago, and he was like, so I remember you from Top Chef, so what are you doing now? And I mentioned that I was in catering, and he was like, oh, is that all? And I was like, wait, what? I mean, it was so offensive to me. And I think that we place so much value on restaurants, and it's great. It's also great for the community. There's so many wonderful things about restaurants, but there's also another side. And that's why I specifically wanted to give a shout out to these personal chefs and a couple of other chefs that I love. Ashley Shanty, who was in Asheville, and she was at Benny on 3rd, but she's moved on, so I have to see what she's doing. And then way out, completely different coast in Portland, Gregory Gourdet. And Gregory has a cookbook coming out this fall, and I was really impressed with it. And it's keto. Everything's made from scratch, including the like the hot sauce and everything. I was like, okay. But there's so many people doing great things, Eduardo Jordan, out west, Kwame Nwachi.
Really look forward to both of you coming to Greensboro. I sincerely hope, that everything works out, that, sooner than later we can get together in person. And, you guys can explore some of the food traditions we have here in this area. And that you will come visit the Greensboro Public Library, and we can continue this wonderful conversation. I
love it. Well, yeah. I'll see you in the fall.
Yes.
I'll see you as soon as I can. You take good care.
Thank you.